And there we go. All right, so our guest this month, Professor Holly Jones of Northern Illinois University. Dr. Jones is at the Institute for the Study of the Environment and the Evidence-Based Restoration Lab. Tonight, she's done extensive research, as Bob mentioned, on populations of birds on islands, specifically seabirds, and their responses when mammals are eradicated from those islands, and also the role of seabirds in the overall island ecology and in facilitating the recovery of the rest of the island ecosystem following the mammals being removed. She's also, or members of her lab do research on restoration of prairie ecosystems, and she's also got some more broader scope research on climate change, adaptation to climate change, ecosystem services, and how biodiversity benefits humans and can help us moderate climate change and so on. So, and I could keep going, but as usual, you didn't come here to hear me. So, Dr. Jones, would you like to take over?
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for that introduction, Josh. And I really appreciate the opportunity to get to talk to you all. Okay, I'm gonna play this and let's see, Bob, you're in my screen. Can you shake your head yes if you see my slides okay? All right, great, awesome. So as Josh mentioned, I work on islands, and when I tell people I work on islands, I think they often picture this: a beautiful white sand beach, turquoise water, perhaps an umbrella drink. But I want to disabuse us all of that notion right now. The islands that I work on are fairly intense to navigate, as they're rugged, steep, and cause all of your senses to be assaulted. When you see these islands and their sheer cliffs, it's awe-inspiring. And on those that don't have invasive mammals, when a boat pulls up, the sky sometimes will darken with thousands of seabirds that are nesting there. Your sense of smell is assaulted from all the pungent guano and rotting seaweed. And when you have the pleasure of an overnight trip on the islands that I work on, your ears are assaulted with this cacophony. Let's see if it works. There we go. Yeah, so fairly hard to sleep when those seabirds that you heard in that clip are nesting around you, but it's also just really awe-inspiring. So at this point, you're probably thinking, okay, well, if you're not doing it for the sandy beaches and umbrella drinks, then why? And I think this slide of these species is a perfect demonstration of why I work on islands. In terms of what ties all these species together, I might give you an opportunity to unmute or to put in the chat if anyone recognizes what ties all these species together. Oh, you all didn't hear it? No one heard it. Hang on one second. Let me just, don't panic. I'm just gonna adjust my mic real quick. And you'll be able to hear it, I promise. Okay. New system. All right. Okay. Tell me in the chat if you hear it. Not yet?
No, we don't be getting it.
Not yet. Okay, let me put these away and then you will be able to hear it. It's just because I have my. Okay, one more time. Oh. Now? Can you hear it? Barely. Okay, I'm gonna turn it up. We got it. Sweet. Okay. Yeah. So that's what the birds sound like on the islands I work on. I'm gonna stay like it is. Can everyone hear me okay, even though I don't have my AirPods in? Now that I switched to my computer?
Yep, you sound great.
Sweet, thanks. Okay. Someone got it right in the chat. Awesome. Yeah, horrible clatter, says Juliana. Agreed. What ties all these species together? And that's that they're all extinct. In fact, all 23 species you see here were declared extinct by US Fish and Wildlife Service last year. And this figure also shows nicely the plight of island species in particular, because 11 of the 23 species are island species. And this illustrates that island species are particularly vulnerable to extinction, which we'll cover a little bit later in the talk. And the idea of 23 species gone forever because of damage we as people have done is really what drives me to pursue the research I do, which revolves around biodiversity. So biodiversity on Earth has evolved over hundreds of millions of years and provides us with a host of things that we really need, like clean air, water, medicine, beauty, and a whole host of other things. But we're losing biodiversity on the planet faster than we've ever lost it on Earth, including in all 5 mass extinctions, like the ones when the dinosaurs were driven to extinction. So people are beginning to realize how much of our well-being depends on biodiversity. And so we spend a lot of effort trying to figure out how to stem that biodiversity loss. And there's 2 sort of major buckets of how to do this. The first is the idea of preservation, or saving the last of the best. This map, which you don't need to really see the details of, that's why it's small, is a biodiversity hotspots map. And the idea behind biodiversity hotspots is if we protected all the areas in red you see on this map, we would save around 2/3 of the world's biodiversity. Alternatively, restoration is concerned with what we do to repair any damage a removed threat has caused to ecosystems. So this graph from the World Resources Institute shows the global potential for restoring former integrated forest land. And the graph shows that globally over 1 billion hectares of land offers opportunities for restoration. And that's a global combined area greater than that of China. And restoration is really necessary because the Earth has already been degraded everywhere. You can imagine that if this graph had the potential to restore every ecosystem type, the whole world would be alight in color, including even the oceans. And good quality restoration is really needed to ensure the planet can continue to support the biodiversity as well as people's well-being. And even in the context of biodiversity hotspots, restoration is important because to be included, 90% or more of the area has to have been altered somehow. So these approaches really go hand in hand. In fact, most biodiversity conservation and restoration fall somewhere along the continuum between preservation and restoration rather than squarely in one or the other. My research focuses more on the restoration end of the spectrum though. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about my research program, and then we're going to zoom into islands and focus on them today, even though I have a broad swath of types of research, as Josh mentioned. So the 3 components of my restoration are as follows. The first sort of broad question I like to ask in my research is, how can ecological theory be used to guide restoration priorities? When restoration ecology first emerged as a scientific discipline, rather recently actually, many of the projects were carried out without the aid of basic science principles. I believe that restoration is best guided by science, and so one component of my research is to ask how ecosystem resilience can be used to guide and prioritize large-scale restoration efforts. The second broad question I ask with my research is, how do biodiversity and ecosystem functioning recover following disturbances? As I said before, there's so much potential for restoration on our planet that this is a really key question to tackle prioritizing restoration projects. And the last broad question my research program asks is, how can ecosystem engineers be used to help damaged ecosystems recover? ecosystem engineers have this outsized impact on ecosystems relative to their abundance. And so they can be the target of recovery and reintroduction efforts. But it's important to understand how they're impacting the ecosystems that they're in. And it's also the way I managed to combine the seemingly disparate components of my research, prairie restoration and island restoration, under one umbrella. And that's because the prairie part of the research looks at bison reintroduction and its impacts on prairie ecosystems. And the research I'm about to tell you about today focuses on seabirds and their ecosystem engineering roles on islands. So I'm not going to cover any theory today. I hope you're taking a big breath of fresh air from that. And I'm solely going to focus on seabirds as ecosystem engineers, even though I'd love to talk about bison if anyone wants. Okay, so 5 major components of the talk today. Going to cover various topics about islands restoration and tell you a little bit about the research that I've done both at the global scale and then zoomed into some particular islands I've been working on for a really long time now. But before I do that, I just want to talk a little bit about why islands. So islands make up a tiny proportion of Earth's landmass. Only about 5% of our terrestrial ecosystem is made up by islands, but they house 45% of the world's critically endangered species. And they also have this dubious distinction of having 64% of the recorded extinctions. So 64% of extinctions in the last 400 years have been island species. And 84% of those extinctions have been caused by invasive species, including predators like rats, cats, and a whole host of other things. And just to illustrate what invasive species can do on an island, I want to tell you the story about the Stevens Island wren. So the Stevens Island wren is an endemic species that was only found on Stevens Island, which is an island in New Zealand that's actually one of the islands I work on, one of my study islands. And the lore of this island and this bird goes that there was a lighthouse keeper that brought his family there, including their cat, to the island. And this cat was pregnant and it got loose and had its kittens out on the island. And in less than a year, the Stevens Island wren was driven to extinction from the predation of that cat and its kittens. And so this happened in 1894. And, I think that's just a really tough pill to swallow, right? One predator, just that one cat that was pregnant, and one species gone forever. And so invasive species have been introduced to around 90% of the world's island archipelagos. So this is not a small problem, it's a global problem. And here I have pictured a few of some of the most devastating invasive species, invasive rats, and cats, and stoats or weasels. So the omnivores specifically, so like the rodents, the rats and mice, are particularly pernicious because they're omnivores and they eat everything in sight when they get to islands, including plants and vertebrates, reptiles, and land birds, and seabirds. And at this point, you're probably thinking to yourself, what is going on with these island species that they're so vulnerable? Why so many extinctions on islands? And to illustrate why, I'm going to blow up this picture of a seabird here. So this is a Laysan albatross, and its nest is being approached by this smallest invasive rat species, the coyote or Pacific rat. And that rat's about 65 grams. And so the thing is that ostensibly the Laysan albatross could probably scissor right through that rat and protect itself from predation. But Laysan albatross and most other island species haven't evolved with predation. So they have no behavioral, morphological, or life history defenses against invasive species. But they are sort of programmed to incubate their eggs at all costs because they have such low and slow reproduction that incubating a chick is really where it's at for them. And so unfortunately, there are accounts of rats chewing through the necks of seabirds in the span of a couple of nights. And in case you're interested in actually seeing what this looks like, I'm about to show you a slide that shows the photo evidence of this as well as a video of some mice attacking a chick. If that's not something that you want to see right after you ate dinner, please look away for a second and I'll tell you when I've switched the slide. Okay, there's no sound on this one, so don't panic when you don't hear the sound, but on the left-hand side is the Tristan albatross chick basically being devoured by invasive mice on Marion Island. And the National Geographic has both funded the work that I do and covered the plight of seabirds and invasive mammals as well. And so they have a great well, not a whole issue, but an issue that covers this and includes the photo that you see there. Okay, so those of you who have looked away, you can now look back. I have a slide that does not have those things on it. So this predation of seabirds in particular is really devastating to whole island communities. And that's because, as I alluded to earlier, seabirds are ecosystem engineers. So the islands I study are actually termed seabird islands because seabirds breed on them and they play these really important roles. You know, true to their name, seabirds spend most of their lives in the open ocean, but they're obligate land breeders. So they have to come ashore to nest, and they most often pick offshore islands to nest on. And they're really colonial, so they use the presence of other individuals as cues for good quality habitat, so they can nest in numbers of up to the millions on a single island, as long as there are no invasive mammals. And they do a couple of really important things for the ecosystems, including seed dispersal. Those that are burrowing, like the one you see pictured here, do some soil engineering and churn up the soil. And perhaps most importantly, from my perspective, they are flying fertilizer. So they feed on nutrient-rich marine sources, they're top predators in the ocean, and then they bring those marine-derived nutrients back to the islands on which they breed and deposit them, and these islands are otherwise pretty nutrient poor. And so that's a huge pulse of nutrients, and it drives biodiversity on islands. In fact, here's a picture showing just how important this nutrient subsidy is in the Aleutian Islands, which I've worked on in Alaska. So on the left-hand side are islands with seabirds, and on the right-hand side are islands with invasive foxes, which have eaten all the seabirds. And what the studies have shown is that basically without seabirds, the whole ecosystem is shifted from grassland to tundra. And you can imagine that such a dramatic shift leads to dramatic changes in ecosystem properties like nutrient cycling, plant and arthropod diversity, as well as trophic interactions. So this really underscores the important role seabirds play where they breed. And seabird islands are so unique and important, they actually have their own book, which if this is something you're really interested in, I encourage you to check out. All right, so invasive mammal introductions on islands cause extinctions or severe reductions of island species, and also fundamentally change island functioning by reducing the seabirds and those important nutrients that they provide. Luckily, in the past few decades, though, the technology has been developed to completely remove invasive mammals from islands. And this removal is sometimes called eradication. So you'll hear me use that term, these terms interchangeably throughout the talk. So invasive mammals have been successfully removed from over 700 islands, but as with all restoration projects, the question remains whether islands can recover or whether they need extra sort of help to recover. And that's really what I've spent my life's work doing, particularly for the island work that I do. Just at the outset, want to recognize the whole host of funders that have helped with the research you're about to see, and just recognize that this is a really big team and interdisciplinary effort. And I also especially want to recognize the engines of the research that are the people that are the engines of the research in any academic lab, and that's the graduate students that carry out a ton of the research that I'm about to show you. So especially all these women who have worked specifically on the island projects I'm about to show you. Okay, so the first topic I want to get into is how invasive mammal removal has impacted native island animals specifically. So to do this, I got together with 29 of my closest island conservation colleagues and started asking, okay, what does the literature say about animal recovery or restoration or reintroduction after mammals have been removed? And here is what we found. Almost 800 populations of over 300 seabirds, animal species, not just seabirds, on around 300 islands or so, were documented to benefit, meaning their populations increased, or they were reintroduced, or they recolonized, or they newly colonized a place, or they were predicted to benefit. So these are the smaller blue dots. And those that were predicted to benefit, we know that they were threatened or endangered seabird species that experienced an eradication, but there isn't any data suggesting of what happened to their population. So we predict that they benefited due to all of the background that I just showed you. And this is really common in islands. It's hard to get data because it turns out islands are really hard to get to, and not a whole lot of people want to sleep next to the cacophony of seabirds that I showed you at the beginning of the talk. Just to talk a little bit about who's benefiting from invasive mammal removals. I know this is a bird group, but I couldn't resist putting at least a couple herps and a mammal in here. But it turns out it's basically any island species because, as I told you before, they're all very vulnerable to predation. So including all the awesome animals you see here. And then specifically for those species that were reintroduced, I just wanted to show you all 88 of them here. I have a little pie chart to show you how it's broken down, and because you're a bird group, I figured you'd enjoy the fact that it's mostly land birds that have been reintroduced after invasive mammal removal. I study seabirds, so I'm a little sad there was only 8 species that have been reintroduced, but that number is increasing significantly as we speak. And then also invertebrates, mammals, and reptiles have been reintroduced as well. Not only are species recovering, but those ones thought extinct are also being rediscovered. So including the one you see here, which is one of the coolest seabirds in the world, the New Zealand storm petrel. We thought New Zealand storm petrels were extinct for over 100 years until rats and cats were eradicated from Hoturu'utoi Island, which is one of the study islands I work on in New Zealand. And 5 years later, some collaborators of mine saw the New Zealand storm petrels flying around this particular island. And so basically this species was rediscovered after, you're welcome for giving you hope, after mammal eradication. And the coolest time of my island fieldwork life was actually getting to help band New Zealand storm petrels on Hoturu'utoi Island. You know, seabirds are attracted to light. And so what we do to get them to come to us is that at nighttime, they're nocturnal animals, so they'll come to their colonies at night. And so at nighttime, we lay down and we look at the sky. And when it's a good storm petrel night, we just lay there and then someone will yell, "Stormy!" And then we all put these spotlights out into the air and the storm petrel will just fly right into the light. And then they land and we can band them. And so after this cat and rat eradication, we found that this was the sole breeding island of the now critically endangered, no longer extinct New Zealand storm petrels. So really cool. All right, so that's the sort of 10,000-foot view of how animals respond to eradication. But I've always really been interested in sort of whole ecosystem recovery and really getting in my hands into the dirt. And so the next bit of the talk is going to be more about how whole island ecosystems recover and then what role different factors like island size play in seabird-driven recovery on these islands. Okay, so I picked New Zealand to study these particular questions. And the reason why I chose New Zealand is, first of all, it's a really awesome country. I highly recommend you all check it out if you can. But I actually had a scientific reason for picking New Zealand, and it's because they developed the technology to get rid of invasive mammals on islands. And what I wanted to do was set up a natural experiment where I could look at how restoration has progressed with time since mammals were removed. And so that's what you're seeing here is the different islands that we're working on, both in the Cook Strait, which is in the redder color, and in the Hauraki Gulf of New Zealand, which is in the bluer color. So we have data, or we collected data on 8 islands that had never been invaded by invasive mammals. And so this is sort of the restoration goal. And then 14 islands that had been eradicated from 12 to 30 or so years ago when we took these data. And so that gives us a sense of how recovery is proceeding through time. And then 5 islands were currently invaded by invasive mammals. And this was the sort of point from which restoration begins. And so one of the ways that we can ask what role is are seabirds playing in island food webs is using stable isotope analysis. Stick with me, it's not complex. I'm just going to explain it to you briefly. Two stable, the name stable isotope.
trace marine versus terrestrial sources of nitrogen. Because they're longer, marine food chains have higher 15 nitrogen values than terrestrial food chains, which are dominated by 14 nitrogen. Seabirds feed on ocean fish and other things at the high trophic levels of the ocean, and thus their guano is enriched with 15 nitrogen relative to terrestrial sources of nitrogen. Therefore, you can use the ratio of 15 to 14 nitrogen to trace the relative amount of terrestrial versus seabird nitrogen in island food webs. So I can go to an island and I can grab some soil and some plants and some spiders, which spiders are often the top trophic level on these relatively simple island food webs. And I can use stable isotope analysis to tell me how much seabirds are influencing each one of those food web members, which is a really long way of saying when you see high delta 15N values, which is the ratio of 15 to 14 nitrogen, think high seabird derived nitrogen or lots and lots and lots of fairy prions. Okay, so I'm gonna just walk you through this graph before I put data on it, because there's a little bit going on. So just like I said before, the delta 15N values on the y-axis, and that with increasing delta 15N is increasing seabird influence. On the x-axis here, we have time since mammals have been removed, so it's time since eradication. And we've taken data from island soils, from the same species of island plant throughout all of these islands, as well as from spiders throughout all of these islands. And then you'll see the sort of lighter red colors are super small islands, less than 1 kilometer squared. And then the greener color is 1 to 4 kilometers squared islands. And just to give you a sense of, I looked at places in your area that you might be familiar with in terms of the 1 to 4 kilometers squared, those are around the size of Arcadia Wildlife Sanctuary. And then what you'll see on these graphs is that there'll be a line that's green, and that's the value of never invaded islands. So that's like the restoration goal. And then you'll see a red line that is the value for invaded islands. So that's the point from which restoration begins. And so here's what we find. Basically, what we find is that these smaller islands that are, again, around the size of Arcadia Wildlife Sanctuary are recovering pretty quickly. 20, 25 years, we see values that are almost to the never invaded or up to the never invaded values. But it does take some time. So we don't see a ton of recovery in the first, say, 5 or 10 years. So it does take time. Now I'm going to put in some data from a larger island. It's actually Hotaru Atoi, that island I was telling you about that the New Zealand storm petrel was rediscovered around. And what's unique about Hotaru Atoi is it's big. It's about the size of Wendell State Forest. And so it's the blue dots here. And what you can see is that those blue dots are mostly in these red lines, meaning it's functioning like it's invaded. And that's really curious to me because the seabird density on Hotaru Atoi, their seabirds are actually denser than the islands that have had the longest to recover that are smaller. And so what my team and I are thinking is that island size might be playing an important role in nutrient cycling that's currently underappreciated in the community who's looking at seabird influence. In fact, I'm wondering if there's an island size threshold beyond which seabird islands are no longer seabird islands. And so to ask that question, we've been funded by National Geographic Society to add islands that have different areas that fall between around those 400 hectare and then Hotaru Atoi, which is 3,000 hectare island size. And then we're also expanding this to other temperate islands as well as tropical islands. And specifically, we already have data on some sub-Antarctic islands. And this is driven by a PhD student in my lab, which is awesome. Okay, so the recovery you saw on the last slide was exciting to me. And it was kind of interesting because we know that sometimes seabirds don't recover very fast, and that's because of some interesting life history characteristics that they have. And so I was actually kind of surprised to see how fast these islands recovered. In fact, some of those islands, like I said, their seabird densities were nowhere near the never invaded seabird islands that were the sort of restoration goal. So some of the reasons why seabirds don't recover so fast, or sometimes not at all, is because of their phylopatry. So they're programmed to return to breed where they hatched, or at least many species are. And so what happens is when invasive mammals just wipe a colony out, nobody is returning to breed there. And so basically that colony gets wiped out and no one's coming back. And I mentioned earlier, they're colonial. So even those that aren't so philopatric, that might sort of go looking for a new breeding site where they weren't hatched, use the presence of other animals and other seabird species as cues for good quality breeding habitat. And then lastly, many seabirds have really low and slow reproduction. Sometimes they can produce one chick and it's not till they're 7 to 10 years old, and they'll take a breeding hiatus if resources are not good for them. And that's happening more and more these days with climate change. So there's a couple of ways to overcome these life history characteristics and try to get seabirds back actively. So some of those methods are actually pictured here. You see there's a loudspeaker in the top left picture. And what's happening is that speaker is playing the calls of seabirds. And so you basically can trick seabirds into thinking that there's a colony there by playing the vocalizations of their of the species that you're looking to restore. And then there are also decoys there. So these are like fake seabirds, but it makes real seabirds think, oh, okay, my buddies are here and I can probably breed here. Sometimes they'll put up mirrors to give the appearance of actual movement. And then the middle sort of picture on the bottom is an Arctic tern actually trying to feed a decoy of another Arctic tern. So these actually really work. And then the other way to restore seabirds, besides using vocalization playbacks and decoys, is to actually translocate chicks. And this overcomes the philopatric part of their life history. So before chicks have imprinted on their natal colony, chicks will be taken from that colony and moved over to the site where they're interested in restoring seabirds. And then they are fed sardine smoothies until they've fledged. And then the idea is that hopefully they'll come back, they'll imprint on that restored colony, they'll come back and breed there. And so the next thing I want to talk about is where seabirds have been restored, and then what role seabird restoration can play in whole ecosystem recovery. And so to ask where have seabirds been restored, a whole big group of us got together to collate information from over 600 experts and every published literature we could find, including Steve Kress, who harkens from out your way and was one of the sort of people that really got seabird restoration methods going on Eastern Egg Rock in Maine, in the Gulf of Maine. And so here's what we found. Seabird restoration is really being increasingly used globally. Here in the lighter blue are social attraction, or basically vocalization playbacks and decoys. And then the darker blue are where chicks have been translocated. So you can see this has happened all over the world. There have been a total of 857 different projects in 48 different countries, restoring 138 seabird species, which is pretty amazing given there are only around 330 or so actual seabird species in the world. And just to give you a sense of how seabird restoration and the methodology of it has proceeded with time, in the 1950s, there was a trial translocation of short-tailed shearwaters on Fisher Island in Australia. And then there was another in the 1960s, along with some other trials for Laysan albatross in Hawaii. And then in the 1970s, seabird restoration really took off with Steve Kress and his colleagues, where they first applied social attraction efforts for terns, as well as Atlantic puffins, where they translocated chicks down to Eastern Egg Rock, and a whole host of other islands. And then you can see it's starting to increase. Seabird restoration is really sort of taken off as a restoration tool. And I'm just gonna show you here. From there, the global activity using these tools expanded, including the start of translocations in New Zealand in the 1980s. And that's where it really took off because there's been so many mammals eradicated from there. And then the rate of activity has since increased dramatically, like in my research lifetime, which has been some of the coolest things to witness of my career. So you can see a ton of different restoration projects throughout the globe. Pretty cool. But again, I've always been curious about what role seabirds play in island ecosystem functioning. And my real question has been, okay, we can restore seabirds, and if they're back, do they actually speed up that seabird derived nutrients or seabird driven ecosystem functioning on islands? And so here's data that speaks to that. On the y-axis again, we have seabird influence, this time in island soils, and I'm just showing you soils, but the same patterns hold true for plants and spiders as well. But at this time on the x-axis, we have distance from colony. And then the colored in circles are inside a colony, and the non-colored in circles are outside of the colony. And then we have two kinds of colonies here. A natural colony, where seabirds always were, and then a restoration colony where seabirds were reintroduced through chick translocation. And the two islands that these data come from are Maud and Mana Island in New Zealand. And so what you can see is that we have, a high amount of seabird influence in these colonies, though a little bit lower in the restored colonies versus the natural colonies. But that influence sort of tapers off the further we get away from colonies. And I was curious as to whether this sort of tapering off away from colonies was similar on an island that was never invaded. And so now I'm going to show you data from Stevens Island. Remember from the beginning of the talk when I talked about the Stevens Island wren, these data are from Stevens. And what you can see on Stevens, which is just pockmarked with seabirds, it's never had rodents, and the seabirds came back quite quickly after the cats were gotten rid of. You can see there's just tons of seabird influence, especially in the colonies, but that it doesn't dissipate the further you get from the colony. And so my take-home message from this is really that we can restore seabirds, and that's exciting, and that seabird restoration can speed up recovery, at least inside the colonies, but it may take a while to see this island-wide seabird influence that we see on these never invaded islands. Okay, so I've been talking a ton about what's happening on islands themselves, but I was actually a marine biology undergraduate major, and I've always been curious about ocean ecosystems and really wanted to work in ocean systems. But I jumped to islands because I found out that they were really where the extinction crisis was. And so very few people have actually connected the land on which seabirds breed to the surrounding marine ecosystems. Obviously, seabirds are putting tons and tons of nutrients onto these islands, but those nutrients have to go somewhere, and especially when it rains, they get washed off into the surrounding marine environment. But again, very few people had actually connected the dots with data to ask, what is the role of seabirds in surrounding marine environments, and how does that change with and without invasive mammals? And so a couple of graduate students who I helped advise took on this particular project, and they're pictured at the bottom. Steph Burrell is holding a floofy seabird chick, and she did the terrestrial work for this project. And then Lindsay Rankin did the scuba diving and marine work for this. So for this work, we worked in the Mercury Islands, which is an island archipelago off the northern part of New Zealand. And we had islands again with different restoration treatments. So we had 4 islands, 2 of them had never been invaded. One of them had rodents eradicated 30 years ago, and another had rodents eradicated just that particular year. And what Lindsay and Steph did was they tried to match up where they were taking data so that they could try to link what was happening in the terrestrial environment with what was happening in the surrounding ocean. And I'll just walk you through some results. So in terms of what we found in the marine environment, what Lindsay found was that macroalgal communities become more similar to never invaded islands following eradication. So you don't have to worry about the axes of this graph. What you need to know is that each dot represents a macroalgae community composition. So you can see the quadrat in the picture there. Each one of these dots represents the number and relative abundance of the macroalgae that was found in that particular quadrat. And the farther away the dots are from each other, the more dissimilar those macroalgae communities are. And what you can see here is that the never invaded islands in the sort of lower right have pretty unique community assemblages. But the island that had been eradicated over 30 years ago, which is in the sort of blue, the top middle, those islands are closer in their community composition of macroalgae to the never invaded islands than the one that had just had the eradication happen, the purple one. And Lindsay was also interested in studying what was impacting seabird signatures in macroalgae communities. And so again, on the y-axis here, we have seabird influence, or delta 15N. And so she did her measurements both in the dry season and the rainy season. So the top graph shows that basically there's more seabird nutrients running off into the macroalgae and found in macroalgae tissue in the rainy season, which makes sense. And then the middle graphs show basically that as you get more wave action, the seabird signature that you can detect in macroalgae decreases. And so you have to account for wave action when you're trying to use stable isotopes to track seabird influence in surrounding marine environments. And then lastly, what you can see is that in those areas that had really steep slopes, there was higher seabird influence, probably because as the rain falls, you get more and more runoff. And like I said before, we were interested in connecting the terrestrial with the marine. And so what this graph does is it explains, or it shows, which part of the variation of these different macroalgae species, and those are all along the x-axis, is driven by either terrestrial variables, things like the slope, as well as the aspect. By marine variables, this is again things like depth and wave action. By seasonal variation, and this is whether it was in the rainy or the dry season, or by seabirds, specifically seabird density and the amount of seabird-derived nutrients in island soils. And then transect location is just something we have to account for because we imagine that macroalgae communities are going to be different according to that. Okay, so on the top, we have the most recently eradicated island. And then on the x-axis, again, it's the different macroalgae species that we see on that island. And the colors are what proportion of the variance in those macroalgae communities we see. And what you can see here is that the most color that you see here is the teal color, or the marine. So basically this means that the ocean is driving the composition of macroalgal communities on this island. So specifically depth and wave action are really driving the differences in abundance of macroalgae. But for the older eradicated and the never invaded island, you see a lot more purple and you see a lot more green come in. And this means that those islands are really driven by seabird nutrients. So the macroalgae composition are driven either by slope and aspect, or seabird nutrients and seabird density. And that's true of both the old eradication and the never invaded islands. And I think that's interesting and gives us hope that eradication or removing mammals can actually restore this linkage from land to sea. It seems like they're functioning similarly. Okay, so just to sum up what I've talked about today, the first thing I want to stress is that invasive mammal removal is one of the most effective conservation tools we have to combat the biodiversity crisis. I am a conservation biologist, and I would never say that we have a conservation silver bullet. I don't think that's true. But if we had one, this is as close as it gets. When most of the extinctions are island species, and when you know invasive mammals can have such strong impacts and drive extinctions, and when you see the recovery on these islands with your own eyes like I have, you really start to understand that this is a really important conservation tool. The second thing is that islands can recover, and that recovery is driven by seabirds. And island size may play a role. Stay tuned for that. We hope to learn more about that. Last thing is that the linkages between seabird islands and surrounding marine systems can recover after eradication, but again, it's likely to take a little while. So a lot of people ask me, well, can islands recover after invasive mammal removal? And what I'd say is that all of these species that naturally on their own recolonized islands after invasive mammal removal would suggest that, yeah, they can recover after mammal removal. I think some islands will take more work than others. I think some cases we might need to restore seabirds back. But we're clearly seeing recovery out there, and that's exciting. Just want to thank my lab again for being the engines of my research program and keeping me honest and also keeping me excited. Seeing the world through their eyes is always very exciting. And I'll thank you for your time and invite questions.
All right, thank you very much, Holly. It's an excellent talk. Very fascinating stuff. I'll toss out a question or two to start us off while people in the audience are getting their own formulating their own questions. So, first one I want to ask is that once we're done with COVID and everything, and we go back to meeting in person instead of on Zoom, you mentioned sardine smoothies. Are you going to bring us all samples? Oh, I'm afraid you got muted. Let's see.
I know, that's amazing. You all can make your own sardine smoothies anytime. You don't need me to make them for you. I am here to invite you to do that. Yeah, you know, the people who came up with the methods and sort of have honed them through the years are just amazing. But yeah, essentially what you end up doing is putting store-bought sardines into a blender and just blending them right up. So I offer that to you for an omega-3 rich breakfast, lunch, or dinner at any time.
Sounds delicious. Okay. I guess I had another question, which also one just popped up in the chat that kind of is parallel to mine. So the one in the chat asks about mosquitoes and mosquito-borne diseases, which I actually was in Hawaii recently, and where that's a very, very central theme. Do you have can you share anything about the prospects for eradicating mosquitoes and sort of restoring bird populations following that kind of problem?
Yes, and I actually was just interviewed by a woman writing for Audubon magazine last week, today Monday, yeah, last week, who was covering a story about honeybees on Kauai, depredating both chicks and adults as well. So it's not just mosquitoes. I mean, and mosquitoes have been a problem for a really long time with avian malaria and a whole host of other things. But anyway, honeybees are going for seabirds as well. Okay, this is a tough one. Invertebrates are especially tricky, less tricky than plants, which are even trickier, but invertebrates are especially tricky to get completely rid of. But there are different technologies, including gene drive. I don't know if you all remember when Zika hit and they were talking about releasing, and they did end up releasing mosquitoes that would breed with the mosquitoes that were transferring Zika and make them sterile. That technology is already being employed in different places and could potentially be used in the island world and for invertebrates. You know, it can be really tricky though, and risky. And so many conservation organizations that work on islands are helping to fund this type of research. And in fact, Island Conservation, which is actually where I got my start, they're a nonprofit that removes invasive mammals from islands, has been putting money into research scientists and genetic research scientists that work on the East Coast to try to see if they can create gene drive for invasive mammals, rather than using the technology that we currently use, which is often rodenticide, or brotificum specifically. So stuff's in the works, but it's not at the point where we can deploy it at scale. And safety is going to be a particular consideration because these islands are already so fragile.
Yeah, and actually, you mentioned the GMO mosquitoes, and I actually just saw a headline about that, I think this morning, that they're doing a major release of those on Key Largo in Florida, to try and have an impact there. So
yeah, and it's not the first time they've done it in Florida. They've been doing it in Florida for a while.
All right, another question up in the chat. So it says, let's see, if you said it, I missed any ideas you might have about why large islands recover more slowly than small ones. is it just because the contribution of marine nutrients is more dominant as one gets closer to the ocean?
Maybe we're looking into it. I didn't say it. I glossed over it because we don't know is the short answer. But yes, so there are a couple of things. Perimeter to area ratio likely matters a ton. And so bigger islands just have, different perimeter to area ratios. I also think, seabirds on bigger islands, they can be choosier about where they're breeding. Whereas on smaller islands, they just densely populate everywhere. And so their influence on those bigger islands may just not be as island-wide as necessary to produce the same responses we see on smaller islands. And I don't want to make that seem like it's a bad thing. That's fine. Bigger islands just may function differently. I also think that, on Hoturu-Otoi, which was that big island, the only big island we had in the study that I just showed you, it's unique in a couple of other ways. It's so big, it has a cloud forest on it. And even though we were collecting these data from the seabird colonies on Hoturu-Otoi, it could just be that seabirds aren't the predominant things driving nitrogen cycling on those islands for a whole host of other ecological reasons.
Okay, let's see, back to a question of mine that I had on hold, sort of parallel to the one about controlling insects. And you talked a lot about rodents and rodent control. In terms of going to the next step up in the ecology, controlling of predators, and sort of multi-level effects. I know I've heard people argue that removing cats from islands could have a negative impact because you get increases in number of rodents as a result. Though I've got some, I spent one summer work interning on the Farallon Islands off California, where I understand there's things going on now where the mouse populations out there have become a magnet attracting burrowing owls to the islands, and then the burrowing owls are having a negative impact on the seabirds too. So if you want to, do you have anything you want to talk about with regards to predator control and how that fits into the restoration picture?
Yeah, so what's interesting is that I worked on the Farallon Islands for a little while too, but for island conservation, we did a feasibility study of getting rid of those invasive mice. And there was just a meeting of the California Coastal Commission where I testified about the benefits of removing invasive mammals from islands, because a lot of people were worried about what dropping rodenticide on the island might mean for not only those raptors, but just environments in general. Which are, obviously understandable concerns. The other thing that, if you're interested in this, basically what happens to food webs when you're removing a predator and there are other predators there, there's the island fox golden eagle example on Santa Cruz Island, which folks can look up, but I'll get more to answer your questions. So yes, invasive species themselves can be supported by other invasive species. So this is a case of like, if you get rid of cats that on an island which also has invasive rodents like rats or mice, basically what's going to happen is that those rodents will no longer be controlled, their populations will no longer be controlled by cats. And you might get what we call hyperpredation, so just a ton of predation and higher population sizes of the rats. And so when we have islands that have multiple invasive species, we have to be very careful about the order in which we remove invasive species or try to get rid of all of them at once. When it comes to native species then being supplemented by invasive species, like what you're talking about is occurring on the Farallon Islands, generally it resolves itself pretty easily once you get rid of those invasive mammals. The burrowing owls don't have anything to support them, and then they leave and go somewhere else. But during the project itself, you have to be really careful if you don't want to, secondarily poison those raptors. And so there are tons of different mitigation measures that folks that do this work take. So for example, I worked on Anacapa Island, which is a Channel Islands island. off the coast of Ventura in California. And there were raptors there, and when we were getting ready to get rid of the rats or poison the rats. And so we took the raptors in captivity and then re-released them after we knew there were no more carcasses around or bait in the environment. And so there's a ton of different things that you can do to try to prevent non-target deaths. And it's done actively, especially for species of concern. Anacapa Island's another good example of this in a different way. They have native deer mice on that island. And so there was a ton of work that went into asking how many deer mice would we need to recolonize the island after rats are removed in order to maintain the genetic diversity of the endemic deer mouse. And so what ended up happening is we had mice in captivity, and we did a staged eradication because there were 3 different islets of Anacapa where there were always mice living out in the world. And then we got rid of rats, and mice died too. And then we reintroduced mice from the other islets and then did the other 2 islets basically. So yeah, there's a ton of different hard work and effort that has to be done to make sure that these operations are targeting what we want and not what we don't want.
Wow. Yeah, tangled web. We have a new question up in the chat column. And you show that horrifying video of the mice going after the albatross chick, which I have to confess, I was one of the people who kind of looked the other way during that, because
Fair. That's why I give you a warning.
We have a question about that specific situation with the rats and albatrosses. What is happening on those islands to bring the rats under control?
So what's wild is that those were mice. Those were invasive mice. And until recently, we thought invasive mice were less intense in their impacts than rats are. But what we've learned since then, and what's been happening on some of these islands that just have invasive mice on them, where we got rid of invasive rats on these islands, and mice are there, but it's not that they've been released or anything. We got rid of rats a long time ago. Anyway, what we found is that mice are really bad too. So that video and that picture were invasive mice. But mice are being eradicated from the 3 main islands where this basically the scalping of albatross has been happening. Midway Atoll is one of them, and there was an eradication scheduled. So I had a master's student who was going to work on invertebrate communities before and after the Midway Island mouse eradication, but COVID hit and it got delayed, and they were going to do it this summer, but it got delayed 1 more summer. So mice will be removed from Midway Atoll, hopefully next summer in 2023. So that's one place. And then the other 2 islands are Marion Island and Gough Island. And the Gough Island eradication for mice just happened. We still see some mice on that island though, so they're gonna have to go back and reapply. And that does happen with mice specifically. They're a little bit harder than rats to get rid of. So yes, like when things like that are happening, especially for seabirds that are critically endangered or endangered, the conservation community tries to move as fast as possible, but these things cost money and time and effort. And so sometimes it's not as fast. Well, it's always not as fast as I would like.
And one more thing that COVID has made go bad in the world, like there weren't enough.
Yeah. COVID's bad for conservation.
Let's see, one more of my questions, and anyone in the audience who has a question they haven't asked yet, we're getting near the end of our time here, so ask now or forever hold your peace, or at least until the next time we bring Professor Jones back. But so you gave us the really kind of some of the wonderful news of species returning, and especially that one storm petrel that was thought extinct, and we now know otherwise. So in terms of bigger trends, I assume someone's probably mapped out kind of species that have gone extinct by decade by decade. And now that we're kind of aware of how bad exotic species are for islands, and we're actively working on sort of preventing or removing exotics and bringing back some of what they've harmed. What's the overall trend in terms of extinctions? Is there any noticeable difference, or are we still losing species at, like, the number of species per decade at about the same rate that we were in, the 90s and the 80s and further back?
All right, so in general, yeah, we're losing fewer species because we've been doing this, getting rid of invasive mammals since the 70s, but scientifically quantifying that is a little bit harder, right? Like, so that picture I showed you of all those 23 extinct species, the ivory-billed woodpecker was in there. Like, things have been extinct for a long time, and to declare them extinct takes longer. And then there's also this thing called the extinction debt, where even though there are some populations hanging on, they're not reproductively viable in any way. So even though we don't call them actually extinct, they are, for all intents and purposes and ecological purposes, extinct. So I think it will take longer to actually scientifically be able to show the decline in specifically island species extinctions, but there's just no way it's not slowing down after we're basically addressing the biggest cause of those extinctions.
Okay, that's good to hear. Okay, two more questions kind of related to each other just came up. So number one, when you've kind of poisoned all of the rodents on a given island, what happens with the rodents that have been poisoned? Do you go around and collect them, and what happens to the ones that, say, die in some I forget the word, but some part of the island that you can't get to?
Yeah. Okay. So real talk, some of the worst days of my career were working for island conservation and doing the sweeps of islands after we dropped bait, because I don't like to see any animal die, including invasive mammals. So most mice and rats die in their burrows beneath the ground, and they're left there. The bait that has been formulated for these operations decomposes really quickly, and it gets into the food web a little bit. Like, invertebrates will eat it, but they're not. It's only mammals that are affected by the bait itself, or vertebrates. Excuse me, it's only vertebrates. So because we time these things so that as few birds and seabirds are on the island as possible, and we do a whole host of other things to make sure that any vertebrate on the island isn't actually getting any bait. The little bit that happens in the environment doesn't actually end up impacting higher trophic levels for the most part. But the ones that do die outside their burrows, and some do, are collected, and they're taken in for necropsies, and a whole bunch of science is done both on them as well as invertebrates and soils and the surrounding marine environment, just to make sure the impacts were what we expected.
Okay, and then the related one to that, when you've conducted one of these rodent eradication campaigns, how do you go about kind of ground truthing and confirming that the rodents you were trying to control are actually gone?
So this is another one that's, like, from a scientist perspective, kind of the worst, because basically you need to trap and track for rodents for 2 years before something is considered a success, an eradication success. So we go out to these islands and we hope for zeros. That's what we hope for. And mostly we get them as the technology has been more and more advanced. But yeah, so you go out there and you put tons and tons of traps on the ground, you put tons and tons of tracking tunnels on the ground, and a whole host of other things like bait out there, not poison, but like anything that's delicious to rodents, including peanut butter discs and stuff. And you see if there are chew marks on those, and you see if there are any ink, footprints on the ink pads of the tracking tunnels, and you check those traps, and you hope you get zeros for 2 years.
All right, great. Well, I think our flow of questions has dried up a bit. So unless any last second ones come popping up, I wanna thank you very much for giving us this talk, and if this was in person, you'd be getting the standing ovation right about now. But yeah, and hopefully sometime we can bring you back when we're doing meetings in person. You can talk about some of the other aspects of your research that you're working on, kind of beyond this. Oh wait, a new question just came up. Can you recommend an organization that if someone wanted to donate to support the sort of work that you're doing, and in particular with an emphasis to off New England or the Northeastern US, do you have any recommendations for groups people could support? And
yes, so the group that does great work, which is actually where I got my start in science, is called Island Conservation, islandconservation.org. They work globally, including on any islands on the East Coast. If you're interested specifically in birdie type projects, I'm sure many of you have heard about Project Puffin, which Steve Kress, who started reintroducing puffins in the Gulf of Maine. I'm sure some of you are familiar with that, but check out Project Puffin.
He gave a program to our club a few years ago.
Yeah, so that's sort of the organization that he started through the Audubon. But Island Conservation's who gets rid of those invasive mammals, and they work globally, including islands on the East Coast.
All right. Well, hey, thanks again. I was wondering, I'm gonna, let's see, pause, stop the recording now.